From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast, with workplace mental health becoming a priority for businesses who want to retain staff and prevent burnout. This is the source of information for creating sustainable and psychologically healthy workplaces in Canada.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Psych Health and Safety Canada. I'm Kim MacDonald and I'm your host, and today my guest is Charmaine Hammond. I'm very excited to hear Charmaine's perspective on psychological health and safety and the story that is a part of what she'll share with us today. Charmaine, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be with you. Looking forward to this conversation.
Me too. My first question to my guest is to ask them to introduce themselves.
Wonderful. Well, where do I start? I'll take you on the short journey. I started out my career in the correctional worker system. So I was a correctional officer for about 10 years in adult facilities, and then moved into working with young offenders, which is where I really developed a passion for training and creating psychologically safe and healthy workplaces. I didn't know that term way back then, but I noticed that coming from the adult system into the young offender system, there were such differences in the environment and the workplace culture. And from there, I went back to school and got trained and certified as a chartered mediator, and was mediating in the workplace and family and community sectors for many years, facilitating conflict resolution and negotiations. And that's where I would say I developed a passion for speaking and training, because much of the work I was doing with corporate clients, they were asking me to come into their organization and help their employees and their leaders learn the skills of resilience building, team building, and conflict resolution. So for 30 years, I've had my business that works in the area of conflict resolution, building healthy teams, working better together, and resilience. And one of the things I've got to say is I love the emphasis right now that is being put on psychologically healthy and safe workplaces. The narratives are changing, and I'm seeing organizations, or at least the ones I work with, that are really embracing the notion and actions around creating safe workplaces that are emotionally safe and physically safe.
Which lets me jump into my next question, which I also always ask all my guests, which is from your perspective, how would you define psychological health and safety?
Well, what a great question. I think about environments that I worked in over the years that I would say are not psychologically healthy and safe. And what was missing in those, which is part of how I form my definition now, is that some of those workplaces were ones where it wasn't emotionally safe to disagree or to bring up a different perspective or to question people's thinking in a respectful way. And then certainly working in the correctional system, tremendous efforts were put into place to protect not only the staff, but the inmates and residents. But I learned that physical safety is not just around the physical environment. It's how we talk about it and think about it as well. And so for me, a psychologically healthy and safe workplace is one that encourages and actually invites the differences of opinions, making it safe for people to share their opinions. It's an environment where leaders and company owners and employees pay attention to some of the risks and the near misses that might happen in the workplace, and they develop strategies and actions to correct those. And it's also an environment for me where people want to come to work. It's not an environment where on Sunday night people are losing sleep, dreading coming to work, eating Tums, and finding reasons to call in sick. So it's a place where people want to be.
That is absolutely on the thriving and flourishing end of organizations that are looking at all of the factors that are at play and helping to manage those. I think that's the ultimate goal, that people and work are a beautiful match. And part of this podcast is to help organizations understand that is the opportunity for all workplaces to do some work. And, that's the aspirational, culture for, and get all the other good things done in a workplace that are required to achieve the purpose and and on the commercial side, obviously, make money and satisfy customers.
Yeah.
This the interesting piece of this conversation is that we talk about workplaces and the internal factors and the internal stressors that are happening inside an organization and managing those. But the story that you can share is when an external event happens and the organization, the companies, and the workplaces need to manage and understand that. And that's an interesting component of workplaces really trying to focus on the mental health of their employees. So maybe if you can take me through that story and then we can go from there.
Sure. I've had the opportunity to work in a few different communities that have experienced different types of disasters. And I lived in Fort McMurray, Alberta, Canada for a number of years, and then returned back to the community after the 2016 wildfires that happened in the community. It was an extremely costly disaster. It was a long-standing evacuation in the community. People were evacuated for, I believe it was about 6 weeks. Many were much longer. A lot of people didn't return. And I had the opportunity, it was truly a gift to go back to the community and work with a number of nonprofit organizations, community groups, and some of the businesses around their recovery and the resilience building, and really sort of getting their organizations back on track. And it was a life-changing experience for me, in all honesty, to be a part of that. And the lessons that I learned are lessons that I've been able to incorporate into my own life and into my own business. And one of the lessons I just wanted to share, when we think about these 13 factors, one of the ones that pops out in my mind is to do with the importance of connection. And one of the things that I loved about living in Fort McMurray for many years was just how connected the community was. I just loved living there. And that power of connection was one of the important foundations that helped organizations and people through this crisis. And in other communities that I've worked as well, the power of connection can really help organizations and communities start to rebuild after, whether it's a natural disaster or a community that I heard about a couple of years ago that lost their key. It was a small community and they lost their local gymnasium, their community center, due to a fire. And that was an incredible, challenging, and devastating loss to that community. So crisis can look different in our communities, but connection is one thing that can really help people move forward.
Can you share more about that? So what were some of the conditions, I guess, in the community and inside the organizations that you can give us some practical experiences around that? Yeah.
When the evacuation order was called, one of the nonprofits that I was working with at the time called me immediately. Of course, I was seeing this on the news. I have a lot of friends and colleagues and clients that were in the community, so I was watching this from a distance. But this very, very in tune director of an organization called me to look at creating some opportunities to gather in the location that I lived at the time, and then in the location in another part of Alberta, just for people who were leaving the community and relocating temporarily into those particular communities. And we created opportunities to gather for people to be with one another. And that was really, really powerful. And I've talked to people that were at those meetings, up to a couple of years ago, even a year ago. And they've talked about the importance of just being connected to people who are going through the same or similar experience. And that really speaks to the power of lived experience or shared experience. When we fast forward now, the Fort McMurray wildfires, the Wood Buffalo wildfires, were in 2016. And shortly after that, I think it was a couple of years later, they also experienced a very, very serious flood. So they went from this fire to then floods and then the pandemic on top of all of that. And so it's been a real challenging time, and the strength and the power of community there, I think, is just such a great example of what it takes to help people move through crisis. And one of the things that we learned, we had the pleasure of working very closely with the Canadian Red Cross and the Canadian Mental Health Association on a film project that we brought to life called Back Home Again. And one of the things that just really stands out from both of those organizations was when they talked about recovering from community crisis and disaster is a very long journey. And when we look at communities that have gone through different types of disasters, sometimes 5, 7, 10 years later, people are still moving through that. And sometimes I think we have an expectation that a crisis happens, people deal with it, and then everyone's fine. And that's not what happens. So what's important for us as leaders and employees in organizations is to not only look at that trauma-informed lens, but to be reminded that grief and change and navigating these crises takes time, and people will deal with it in their very own individual way. There isn't kind of a cookie cutter approach, but there are certainly some things that we can do to help and to aid organizations through that.
What were, maybe just to give listeners a view inside organizations. So there are companies that are still trying to do what they do, which is, people still have to work, or, some may have been trying to do that maybe in the early days, but maybe share a little bit around some of that experience.
Yeah. One of the things that often happens in community disasters and evacuations is that not everybody returns. So some people will return later. Some people didn't return at all. They went back to live with family, for example, or stayed where they evacuated to. So there's an enormous culture rebuilding and culture shift that leaders and employees are having to navigate through. Mm-hmm. And I've seen this in other communities as well. There's not only helping people cope with what has happened and ensuring that people have the right supports to be able to navigate this, being able to, what we saw in some of the communities I worked with was that because of staff shortages and people are really dealing with this enormity of what has happened in the community, workload management became a real issue for people. And so some leaders that I have tremendous respect for really started to zero in on what is the critical functions that need to happen right now? What are the things that we can just put aside? And, just that in itself can provide tremendous relief for people when they just need to focus on what are the urgents, what are the things that we need to deal with now as a team. Another challenge that some of the leaders have talked to me about when there's been community crisis is that job shadowing. And I've actually seen a lot of leaders now take these incredible steps to creating opportunities for employees to learn more about each other's roles. So that if there was something that happened, it doesn't mean it was a disaster, but if somebody was away from the workplace unexpectedly, people can step in. And that kind of keeps things going. And I think it creates a sense of stability in the workplace and obviously psychological health and safety. And then some other things that I've seen leaders do to help teams navigate through crisis is looking for meaningful ways to connect. Now, if we think about, the last 4+ years in this world of Zoom and virtual, working virtually and remotely, leaders and employees have had to really work hard at staying connected with people. But there was a research report done a number of years ago. I believe it was the University of Alberta. And what stood out for me is that they had interviewed people who had gone through a community crisis. And one of the findings was that the number one strategy or the number one thing that helped people move through and retain a level of resilience was human connection. And so I'm seeing lots of leaders now that are looking for meaningful ways to connect. It's not just a team building when things are tough to reignite people. It's those ongoing opportunities. And I think about one group that I worked with, they actually put it out to the staff about what are some ways that we can communicate or connect with one another, not just about work. And they ended up creating a travel club. This particular team had a team that many of their families lived in other parts of the world. And so they were often traveling back home, and they created these travel clubs to learn about different cultures and also where people on their team lived and came from. Another group started to create connection by having a book club. Another group started doing stair walking at lunchtime, but there was these informal, non-work task-related activities to bring people together, which if you think about that, if something difficult or traumatic happens in the workplace, you have this team of people who are connected and can lean in and support one another.
That proactive work when things are, this is some post-event learning.
Yes.
During the evacuation where organizations are still, we hope that everyone in every workplace will assume that kind of flexibility. When we are in stress and there's a great deal of uncertainty in a workplace, we also know that rigidity and inflexibility can sometimes come up as a response to some of those things. And we do know as Canadians, we do respond well to those kinds of, and many countries do, when there is crisis in our community.
Yeah.
However, that struggle with an organization trying to continue the work and be understaffed.
Yeah.
What are the things that a workplace leader or manager needs to do or remind themselves of when they are trying to navigate through that? Because we can also want to do that, but also need to get the work done.
Yes, exactly. One of the examples that I've seen this in several communities where they have, it's called different things, but it's basically a cohort of leaders. And I've seen this primarily in the nonprofit sector, actually, where executive directors and leaders of organizations will come together every month or every 6 weeks and sort of, it's their support group, for lack of a better word, their support group as leaders. But what I've seen happen from these types of cohorts is some, I think, very innovative and incredible solutions. One of those being there were 2 organizations that served a similar audience, but provided completely different services. And the leaders were getting together and talking about their struggles with staff shortages and that the demands in their community after crisis had really increased, and having to really look at what services do we really need to focus on. And these 2 organizations came together and partnered and started to become each other's backup. So they each had a crisis line. And the challenge was finding volunteers and making sure that staff didn't burn out from being on the line. So they actually were each other's backup. When one group was in a staff meeting, the other crisis line, the lines would direct over there. And I thought that was an incredible example of leadership and finding a solution that didn't have there was no financial impact to either organization. But what started to happen in the background is now these 2 organizations, the teams are starting to gel. So the staff are developing these relationships. They're learning from one another. And, when we think about sustainability or capacity building in an organization, that's a great example of one of the outcomes. Another example was that in a community that is experiencing a disaster, sometimes the support is flooding in from around the world. Sometimes not the right support, but there's support flooding in around the world, and the leaders are having to navigate that and doing the business. And so in one community, they actually set up groups again with some of the leaders and the fundraising and public education, I think was the title, public education coordinator of these organizations, to start to look at, instead of how do we just kind of do our own thing, how can we pool this to make a better impact and lessen the impact on our staff and actually be able to help more people. And again, just a great example of collaboration, because what happens is that when the support dries up, could the organization be sustainable? And I thought this was an
Mm.
incredibly forward thinking on the leaders' part and the boards of directors to look at how do we share these resources to make bigger impact instead of setting ourselves up to not be able to continue the service.
I think that's a wonderful way to think about redundancy, that redundancy about, and backup. Wonderful,
Yeah.
creative, collaborative example.
Yeah.
In the private sector, so that's the not-for-profit.
Mhm.
And when do you see it, or what can private sector, how can private sector organizations,
Yes.
when we're in a highly competitive environment, there are other sort of commercial drivers that are happening. Maybe there are competitors, and in the community, the region. Is it as easy for them to come to the table, I guess, and think about how creatively they can, like co-opetition, how can they cooperate together to do those same things when they have these other, not that not-for-profits don't have demands and financial concerns, they absolutely do. It's from a commercial to commercial business.
Yes.
There is an extra layer there.
There is. One of the examples I think that I love sharing this, and I've seen this happen time and time again, where competitors, for lack of a better word, become allies. And a great example of this was there were in one community, there were 3 large employers, very large employers, that all were recruiting for similar positions. And so what happened, and then one of the challenges is when we recruit from different parts of the world or different parts of our own country, there's risk, of course, if the family doesn't come with that worker, are they going to be a short-term employee? Are they going to kind of stay for a year or two and then move back home? Because, of course, they're missing their family. So in this one case, these 3 companies came together and they did a shared recruitment drive. It was fascinating to hear about. What they did is they started to look at, with the positions that they were all hiring, what roles might some of the partners or family members of this potential employee have. So they partnered with the local college, with the hospital, with some nonprofits to learn what their recruitment needs were. So, for example, a hospital might say, I have some LPN positions we need to fill. I have some custodial positions. And the school board might say, we have 3 TA positions. So they partnered with these other employers in the community. And so when they were going out recruiting when the 3 companies were out at recruitment drives or recruiting, they knew what positions were available in the community, and then could actually say to a potential employee, what do your family member? I don't know how they brought it up in the conversations, but what if you were to bring your family, what kind of jobs might your family members be looking for? And I thought that was just a very powerful way for businesses to work alongside groups or organizations or other businesses that they may not normally work with.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
I love that. I absolutely love that. We would love, I think, from a psychological health and safety perspective, and then also that, looking at the factor of growth. So for employees, knowing that, there's more opportunity even in the community, it's definitely a rising tide, rising tide lifts all boats. That's it.
Yeah.
A rising tide lifts all boats. So together, it's sort of that the opposite of the scarcity, I guess,
Yes.
thinking.
Mm-hmm.
What skills and competencies would help managers in those situations if they were to do some work about preparedness?
Yes.
Obviously, it's very difficult to prepare for. You will never be able to prepare for such a community event and the trauma that's going to happen. However, what could they rely on that might support those factors, whether it's psychological support to, clear expectations and leadership, whatever those are what are some of the underlying skills that they can draw on or be honing now to make a difference in preparedness?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is that from that question, it reminds me of some of the 13 factors that come into play. So one that just jumps out at me is, I think it's number 3, around clear leadership and expectations. So those leaders that are communicating, and this is what's so important when there's a crisis that happens in the workplace or in the surrounding community of that workplace, a lot of additional stress happens. And I heard this from hundreds and hundreds of people that I talked to. A lot of the additional stress is coming from not knowing or not feeling updated. And so I have seen so many leaders become exquisite communicators, and they will say things to their team like, we don't have any update from yesterday. Nothing has changed. The other thing that I've seen leaders do, and this actually comes from my conflict management background when I was a mediator, working in family crisis. I used to work with the clients to be able to talk about what is not changing, because in crisis and conflict, we always look at what's going to be different, And it was actually a 7-year-old child that taught me this lesson. I was mediating with a family, and the parents wanted to share with the children what their parenting plan would look like upon the separation. And so the parents had practiced and role played with me to be prepared for this meeting with their children. When they came into the meeting, they didn't follow what they practiced in the role play. They came up with some new version of it, and they focused on everything that was going to be different. And just as I was about to interject, the little 7-year-old flew off the couch in my office and said, "Stop talking about everything that's changing. What's going to be the same?" And I thought,
what a
wow.
lesson, Charmaine. What a lesson.
Even now I talk about it.
What can I count on? What can I count on?
Yes, Kim, what can I count on? What's
the count on right now?
Exactly. So the leaders that are communicating in the workplace while we're going through this change, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and there are questions you have that I can't answer. What I can tell you is here's what's going to be the same. What's not changing is you still have a job. What's not changing is our company values. What's not changing is the care that we demonstrate to each other. And so I've heard leaders list all the things that are not changing. You can feel the tension and the apprehension in the room physically. You can feel that subside. So that's a powerful skill for leaders to become clear communicators and be able to deliver tough news in a way that people can understand it. So sometimes we have to use those cascading messages where we repeat the same information in 2 or 3 or 4 different ways to make sure that people got it. Another skill, Kim, that I see some leaders just excel on is creating readiness plans. In the event of plans, what will we do? And training people on these plans so that people know what to do. When people know what to do, again, the fear goes down so that people can respond in a safe way. And or a crisis plan would be another variation of that. One leader talked to me that they created, he was in the safety and HR department of his company, but they created kind of practice drills. He actually talked to the people in his organization or his company about having a go bag, I think is what he called it. And the go bag was the critical things that would need to be taken if the people ever needed to, evacuate or leave the the workplace, even if it was for a short period of time or, a couple of hours, what would need to be taken in the event of a crisis, but making sure that people know about that as well. So a lot of it comes down to communication and making it safe for people to ask questions. Because in times of crisis, we know that people have a lot of questions. And if they don't feel psychologically safe in that workplace to ask them, that's where assumptions come into play and rumors come into play. And there's misinformation flying around, which then increases fear. And, if people act on inaccurate information, that can be very dangerous or problematic.
Mm. As you were speaking, I was thinking of the other factor, which is around involvement.
Yes.
And the importance for employees to have autonomy and some self-determination in how to organize their work, especially if there's been that disruption. Then I can see how that would be an important conversation inside the organization, so that employees can feel that they have control and that they have that, maybe it's an even a greater sense of autonomy during these times. And so dialing that up and the involvement and involvement in shaping the work and how you do the work and all of those kinds of things, I can see how that would be a benefit during that
absolutely
situation.
Well, you just lead me to the other factor that I think is a great one for leaders and teams, is that training and development or growth and development opportunities. And one of the things that I so appreciated about living and working in the Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo community for so many years was just how much training happened in that community. Safety training, mental health training. I was moving from Ontario to that community. I was just amazed at the focus on training and really appreciated that. And so for leaders and employees, that's another way that we can be prepared and navigate tough situations, crisis, disasters that might happen in the workplace or community, is to be trained. And so when leaders are offering opportunities that are not just training on how to do their job, but for example, training on mental health. We see a lot of companies right now, especially during COVID, that are placing a very, very high focus on mental health training, resilience training, self-care, well-being training. And I think that's really, really important. And certainly training and development will help people if there is a crisis that happens.
I always think that education and training is the game changer for changing your life and changing lives for generations. Like it is the single decision that someone can make that can help shift almost everything. And it's been my experience, my personal experience, and definitely in my family too. So that's there can never be enough investment. I love that the extension of training beyond what you need to do the job and the resources you need to do the job, which is a wonderful evolution, because we used to definitely very much that decision about where the money is spent is definitely to the job. But we know so much more about adult learning, and that we don't divide ourselves like that. So that holistic developmental growth risk factor inside an organization, when there is no opportunity for growth or change or taking stretch, new areas of work, all of those kinds of things can be helpful to someone's growth. And they don't always have to be the investment of money. It could be, as you said, like some creative with another organization. If those organizational relationships have been built, then employees, whether it's job shadowing or getting a chance to go, into another organization to do the work and still be a part of their own organization. That would be a really nice creative solution for growth. It hits, I guess, a couple of risk factors inside an organization for health and safety.
Yes. Well, one of my corporate clients did something really interesting, Kim, just touching on what you're speaking to, is this particular company had limited budget, especially during and after COVID, for training. but recognize the benefits of training, like in the perspective of creating psychologically healthy and safe workplaces. So what they did is they created what employees told me was a really cool, fun project. And the cool, fun project was that when anyone went to training in that particular department, at the next team meeting, that individual would have 10 to 15 minutes to share with the team what the training was, the highlights, something they learned about themselves, something they learned about the team through the training, and 5 nuggets to pass on to everyone who wasn't at that training. And that actually not only was shared verbally, but they had got some feedback that where people were working remotely or weren't at the meeting, they were feeling like they were missing out on the conversation. So what they did is they typed up, and I think in some cases even videoed the team member talking about the training so that everyone had access. And I sat back thinking, wow, what a great example of growth and development, connection, leadership, and an opportunity for employees to learn from one another.
As you were talking about that, I was thinking about organizational justice and fairness. That we have, there's a lot of conversations I have with organizations about that as a challenge, especially when you change how people are working. Certainly if they're in this kind of a situation, but even outside of an event like this, then how you help other employees that don't have that opportunity to go to that training session or to work remotely for a period of time, or all those kinds of things. How organizations need to manage that the change the opportunity doesn't look like I get the opportunity, but someone else gets the opportunity.
Right.
I'm wondering if you can share a little bit on that, because it would be great if organizations could allow everyone every time, when you're responding to these kinds of additional stressors or outside of that, always saying yes, but that's not possible in some organizations.
You're so right on that, Kim. It's not possible. And sometimes when those decisions are not well thought through, it starts to create a precedence that an organization can't follow or can't even afford to follow. So one of the things that I'm seeing leaders start to look at is sort of the flexibility that they have on making different arrangements or, concessions, and how they communicate it. And so sometimes when a decision is made, and it's perceived unfairly by people, sometimes people don't understand why the decision was made and how that is different for them. And so leaders now are really having to think about, how do I communicate this, and what can I actually communicate, and what is private to a particular employee. So you're right, Kim, there's a lot that leaders are wrestling with this. One of the leaders that I've done a lot of work with over the years, and we were talking about how did you navigate this perceived fairness or unfairness during COVID, when people's work schedules were changing and people were having different working arrangements. The leader said, one of the things that I did was any decision that could that they could ask people's input on, they would actually bring that up at the staff meeting. So they would say, here's one of the things that we're wrestling with right now, and I'd like everyone's input and ideas and solutions. And what I heard them say was that so many times the solution, where it was appropriate to get team input from, was actually better than the solution that the leader could have thought of themselves. And so this is interesting, interesting times for leaders to look at, where can we get feedback from the team, and what still is a decision that a leader just has to make and communicate to the team. But I think during COVID and also during community crises, there's a lot of times where people, feel that there's an injustice or unfairness around a particular decision that's been made. The other piece that, so that communication piece, and there's also one of the leaders that I've done some training and work with, said something really interesting to me recently. She said, it's important for us to remember why we made that decision, because if it comes up 2 months later or 3 months later, we might have forgotten why we said yes or no to that particular request. So she's using what I would call like a decision tracker, just tracking the reasoning for some of the changes that she has communicated or some of the decisions that have been made, and then revisiting them, because sometimes they don't need to be that way down the road. So I'm just, seeing some really interesting leadership approaches right now happening that we're seeing through COVID. And it's a big learning for everybody.
It definitely is. And still lots to navigate, because some things have changed, but some things, have to remain the same. And some things it's that pendulum is swinging back, and there's, still a lot for managers to navigate. I always think that middle managers and supervisors are like the peanut butter and jam in the sandwich. So, they are trying to support employees and be that communicator, but they also potentially have they have leaders and other demands on them as well. And they get, that's a very difficult situation. I always say that the best next dollar on training and development is for the supervisor.
Absolutely.
whatever that is.
Oh,
executives, you've gotten enough. It's like it's the next best dollar.
Absolutely.
Is on the supervisor and the manager.
Absolutely.
And that's where the most value up and down and sideways, can really help from a psychological health and safety and a workplace culture perspective.
Yeah.
And also from a productivity perspective.
Yes.
Any other thoughts that you wanted to add on sort of for our listeners on things that they can be thinking about, or advice you want to give them on, perhaps they haven't had a big, they've lived through COVID, as we all have. So they're still we're still all trying to manage some of that. I think when I say that, I'm sure that there are many listeners who go, oh my gosh, are we still? Yes, I believe we are. We are still, even if it's silent, even if we're not talking about it anymore, it's still there. It's still there. Maybe just share a little bit about trauma. There is a lot of conversation in workplaces about trauma-informed leadership and what that looks like. So maybe, I know you have some experience in that, so you can share a little bit on that.
Yes, I think that's a great question, Kim. And it's so important for leaders to understand trauma-informed leadership, and to understand that we all cope with situations, communication, decisions differently, that outside of the workplace, employees have lives that are happening just like that leader or supervisor or manager or company owner. We all have lives that we're navigating, that even while we might say, leave your personal life at the door, it's very difficult to do that. And can make people feel very isolated in the workplace. So leaders that are now really being sensitive and in tune with the fact that there are things in workplaces that can trigger people. And it might not be that they're being triggered about work. It's something that they're dealing with in their personal life. So when the organization or the company has an environment where conversations can happen, where people's mental health and well-being is a priority, where it feels safe to talk about struggles that one might be feeling, and where leaders are checking in, supervisors checking in on people, not just when there's a problem, but just checking in. How are you doing today? Noticing differences around how people show up and having conversations. That's really, really important. And I think can help people tap into the support or help that they might need, instead of feeling like they're having to struggle alone. And one of the other pieces, when you talk about trauma-informed leadership, when I was a mediator many, many years ago, I used to talk to my clients around taking care of the little pebbles in life. And what I mean by that is that we've all had that experience of going for a walk with a tiny piece of a pebble or dirt, something very small in our running shoe. And we want to get walking. And so we don't take time to take the pebble out. And by the end of the walk, all we can focus on is the pebble and how irritated we are by the pebble and the foot hurting, and we're irritated. And my story is around taking care of the little pebbles in life. So in a business or a workplace, what about if we look at what are the irritants I'll give you an example. I remember facilitating a team charter with a group, and the group was really, really stressed out. And as we started to peel that onion and discover what was going on, the frustration was happening from three things. One of the things was that they had a photocopier that only worked when it wanted to work. And it worked at times when it didn't work when people needed it. The coffee maker was constantly leaking over the edge and exploding. And I can't remember what the third thing was, but these
well,
weren't
the coffee
big
maker
things.
alone, Charmaine.
A coffee maker alone.
I am so out of there. I am totally taking my cup, special mug I brought in, and I'm leaving if that's the case.
Right.
No,
And so when the team was able to identify these three elements that were a source of frustration, what an easy solution that was for the supervisor or leader to just get the photocopier fixed and people thought that they had voiced that because they complained about it every time they poured a coffee or the photocopier wouldn't work. But it was never sort of brought forward to get fixed. And so for this particular team, it was a great example of how that team was walking around with a pebble that became a boulder. And the two solutions, the coffee maker and photocopier, very easy fixes. But where was the breakdown? How come it didn't move past complaining in the coffee room to actually doing something so that it could get fixed? And so that team in our work that we did together was able to create that plan and a way of communicating. They created a form, like little steps that had a huge action. So that's something that we can also do in our organizations is make sure that we're looking at the irritants, and so that people have the right tools and resources to do their job. It reduces stress and it helps us feel like we are contributing.
I think that's such a great example. I mean, the question is, for leaders, part of the podcast goal is to help expand the understanding of psychological health and safety as a system and a management framework, and the 13 factors or the ISO standard, and the working conditions and the management practices and social relationships. But I think that even all of that is incredibly important for our listeners to explore. If they can ask the question, what are the irritants?
Yeah.
What are the stressors? What are the things that just cause you the most stress? And start there, as you say, in a simple way. You can get a lot of distance in terms of helping to shift the workplace practices.
Yeah.
And then the commitment from the managers and leaders to follow up and actually do it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, that communication comes in again, which is communicate that they've done it, keep it. It doesn't have to be done forever. It's then continuously, what else can we do? So keeping the ball rolling. So I think it does sometimes, you don't have to boil the ocean. You can start in these where are the harms and the irritants and the stressors? I love that. Thank you for that. That's great. You've shared a lot. I thank you so much, Charmaine. If our listeners wanted to reach out to you, how could they get in touch with you?
They can reach out on social media or on my LinkedIn page with my name, Charmaine Hammond, or my website, charmainehammond.com.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for listening and tuning in. If you're, as you're here, take a look at other episodes, other topics that might interest you. I invite you to share this episode or others with colleagues, peers on LinkedIn or your social. It is our opportunity to expand the reach and deepen understanding around psychological health and safety at work. And also thanks to Flourish DX, the sponsor for this, and bringing us the opportunity to have this podcast. And thank you from me. And until next time.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in North America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.